Dhaka, Bangladesh, January 2016. The Central Bank of Bangladesh sat quietly in the heart of the city, its marble floors polished to a mirror's shine. Inside, employees went about their business, unaware that their network had already been compromised. For months, hackers had been studying the bank's systems, mapping vulnerabilities like cartographers charting unexplored territory. They hadn't needed to break in, they'd simply logged on, exploiting weaknesses so obvious they seemed almost careless. The bank's security infrastructure was a patchwork of outdated technology. Firewalls hadn't been updated in years. Antivirus software ran on versions so old they'd long stopped receiving security patches. Most damning of all, the SWIFT terminal, the critical gateway to the global financial system, was connected to the same network as the bank's public-facing computers. It was like leaving the keys to the vault on the front desk. The most shocking vulnerability was the password system. Administrators used simple combinations like 123456 and password, the digital equivalent of a padlock with no key. One critical account had the password "I love you," the same phrase millions use for everything from email to social media. The bank's security team had been warned repeatedly about these issues, but budget constraints and bureaucratic inertia had prevented meaningful upgrades. To the hackers, it was like finding a bank vault with the combination written on the door. The attack began with a simple phishing email. On January 15, 2016, an employee in the bank's foreign exchange department received a message that appeared to come from a trusted colleague. The subject line read, "Urgent, Quarterly SWIFT Report." The attachment, labeled swift_report_q4.pdf, was actually a malicious executable disguised as a PDF. When the employee opened it, malware known as Dridex silently installed itself on the network. Dridex was a sophisticated piece of software designed for one purpose: financial theft. Once inside a system, it would record keystrokes, capture screenshots, and search for valuable information. Over the next 3 weeks, it gathered everything the hackers needed: login credentials, network maps, and most importantly, access to the SWIFT terminal. The malware operated silently, its activity masked by the bank's outdated monitoring systems. The hackers worked methodically, taking time to understand the bank's procedures and rhythms. They learned when staff took breaks, when security checks occurred, and when the SWIFT system was most active. They discovered that the bank used a simple 2-person verification system for large transfers, meaning they would need to compromise 2 separate terminals to execute their plan. What made the attack particularly insidious was its patience. Unlike many cybercriminals who strike immediately after gaining access, these hackers waited. They studied the system for weeks, learning its patterns and identifying the perfect moment to strike. They knew that rushing would increase the risk of detection. Instead, they played the long game, waiting for the ideal conditions: a holiday weekend when staff would be scarce, and transaction volumes low enough to avoid immediate scrutiny. The hackers' preparation was meticulous. They created fake digital certificates that would allow them to impersonate legitimate bank employees. They developed custom malware designed specifically to interact with the SWIFT system, mimicking the commands a real operator would use. They even studied the formatting of legitimate SWIFT messages to ensure their fraudulent transactions would pass automated checks. Most crucially, they identified the bank's SWIFT administrator account, the digital key to the kingdom. This account had permissions to initiate and approve transfers without additional verification. With access to this account, they could bypass the 2-person verification system entirely. The password? Swifter, a variation on the system's name that was both predictable and tragically insecure. The hackers didn't work alone. Evidence would later suggest they were part of a larger organization with resources far beyond typical cybercriminals. They had access to sophisticated tools, technical expertise, and most tellingly, knowledge of banking procedures that went beyond what could be learned from public sources. Their operation resembled a military campaign more than a simple hack: carefully planned, precisely executed, and ruthlessly efficient. As the attack date approached, the hackers made their final preparations. They tested their malware in a simulated environment, verifying that it could interact with the SWIFT system without triggering alarms. They created a list of recipient accounts in the Philippines, choosing destinations that would be difficult to trace. Most importantly, they established multiple fallback positions. If one part of their plan failed, they had alternatives ready to deploy. The target was ambitious: $1 billion. It was an almost unimaginable sum, but the hackers had calculated that the SWIFT system's daily transfer limits and the bank's available reserves made it possible. They would attempt to move money to accounts at the Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation in Manila, knowing that Philippine banking regulations would give them a window to move the funds before anyone noticed. On February 4, 2016, the hackers made their first move. Late at night, when network traffic was minimal, they accessed the SWIFT terminal and began testing the system. They sent small, legitimate-looking transactions to verify their access and familiarize themselves with the process. Each test was carefully documented, with notes on response times, verification procedures, and any potential red flags. The bank's security systems registered these activities, but the alerts were dismissed as routine. The monitoring software generated hundreds of false positives daily, and staff had grown accustomed to ignoring them. To the bank's employees, everything appeared normal. The network was functioning, transactions were processing, and no alarms sounded. Unbeknownst to them, intruders were walking through their digital halls, taking inventory of what could be stolen. By February 10th, the hackers had everything they needed. They knew the exact sequence of commands required to initiate transfers. They understood the timing of batch processing and reconciliation. They had mapped the entire network, identifying which systems could be compromised and which should be avoided. All that remained was to execute the plan. What they didn't know was that one small detail would save the bank from total devastation. A single typo in one of their fraudulent transfer requests would trigger an alert at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The word foundation was misspelled as Fandation in the recipient's name, a mistake so small it seemed insignificant, but one that would ultimately prevent the theft of $850 million. The hackers didn't anticipate this error. To them, it was just another detail in a meticulously planned operation. They had accounted for technical challenges, human factors, and even potential countermeasures. But a simple spelling mistake? That was beyond their control. As February 11th drew to a close, the hackers prepared for the final assault. They knew the exact moment when the SWIFT system would be most vulnerable. Early Saturday morning, when staff levels were minimal and the weekend's transactions were being processed. They had rehearsed every step, down to the millisecond. Now all they needed was the right moment to strike. The bank's employees went home that night unaware of the digital storm about to hit. The security team reviewed routine logs, noting nothing unusual. The SWIFT operators checked their terminals one last time before heading home. To everyone at the Central Bank of Bangladesh, it was just another Friday night. But in a server room somewhere in Southeast Asia, a countdown had begun. The hackers watched their screens, waiting for the precise moment when the digital gates would swing open. They had found the flaw. Now all that remained was to steal the fortune. Dhaka, Bangladesh, 11:37 p.m., February 11, 2016. The Central Bank of Bangladesh's main branch was quiet, most employees long gone for the weekend. Only a skeleton crew remained, monitoring systems that appeared normal, deceptively normal. In a server room in Southeast Asia, a hacker watched the clock count down to the moment when everything would change. At exactly 12:01 a.m. on February 12th, the attack began. The hackers initiated their malware, which had lain dormant for weeks. First, they disabled the bank's monitoring systems, ensuring that no alerts would be generated as they moved through the network. Next, they accessed the SWIFT terminal using the administrator account they'd compromised weeks earlier. The password Swifter granted them complete control over the system. The hackers worked with surgical precision. They began by sending 35 fraudulent SWIFT messages to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, each requesting a transfer from the Bangladesh bank's account. The messages were carefully crafted to mimic legitimate transactions, using the correct formatting and terminology. Each transfer was for $20 million, totaling $700 million. A 36th message requested an additional $20 million, bringing the total to $720 million. What made the attack so effective was its understanding of banking procedures. The hackers knew that Swift messages sent late on Friday would be processed early Saturday morning, when staffing levels were minimal. They timed their attack to coincide with this window, knowing that delays in processing would give them more time before anyone noticed the fraudulent transactions. Each message was routed to accounts at the Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation in Manila. The recipients were shell companies with names like Shalika Foundation and Solar Company Philippines, entities created specifically to receive stolen funds. The hackers had spent weeks researching Philippine banking regulations, knowing that the country's lax oversight would allow them to move money quickly once it arrived. As the transactions processed, the hackers took steps to cover their tracks. They deleted confirmation messages from the Swift terminal, ensuring that bank employees wouldn't see evidence of the transfers when they arrived at work. They altered transaction logs to show normal activity, creating a digital smokescreen that would delay discovery. Most crucially, they exploited a feature of the Swift system that allowed messages to be marked as printed, tricking the system into thinking the transactions had been reviewed and approved by bank staff. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York began processing the requests at 3:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. By 5 a.m., $81 million had been transferred to the Manila accounts. The hackers watched as the money moved through the system, their screens displaying real-time confirmation of each successful transfer. To them, it was like watching a slot machine hit the jackpot. Only this machine paid out in millions, not coins. The first sign of trouble came at 6:22 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, when an employee at the Federal Reserve noticed something unusual about one of the transfer requests. The recipient's name was misspelled. Shalika Foundation appeared as Shalika Foundation. This small error triggered an alert, causing the Federal Reserve to hold the remaining transactions for verification. The hackers had overlooked this detail in their otherwise meticulous planning. In Dhaka, the bank's staff arrived for work completely unaware of what had happened. The Swift terminal showed no evidence of the fraudulent transactions. The hackers had covered their tracks too well. It wasn't until 11 a.m., when a routine reconciliation revealed discrepancies in the account balance, that anyone realized something was wrong. By then, $81 million was already gone. The hackers didn't wait around to see the aftermath. Once they confirmed the transfers had gone through, they began erasing evidence of their presence. They deleted logs, wiped temporary files, and terminated their connection to the bank's network. The malware that had given them access self-destructed, leaving no trace of its existence. Even the phishing email that started it all had been carefully crafted to leave minimal forensic evidence. What made the attack particularly sophisticated was its use of layered obfuscation. The hackers didn't operate directly from their own systems. Instead, they routed their commands through a series of compromised servers in different countries, creating a digital maze that would be difficult to trace. First, they connected from a server in Taiwan, then to one in Malaysia, then to another in Vietnam, before finally reaching the Bangladesh bank network. Each hop added another layer of anonymity, making it nearly impossible to determine their true location. The malware itself was a masterpiece of digital engineering. It didn't just facilitate the transfers, it actively worked to prevent detection. It monitored the Swift terminal for signs of human activity, automatically pausing its operations when bank staff were logged in. It created fake transaction records that matched the bank's normal activity patterns, ensuring that routine audits wouldn't raise red flags. Even the timing of the transfers was carefully calculated to match the bank's typical Saturday morning activity. As the Bangladesh bank staff scrambled to understand what had happened, the hackers were already moving the stolen funds. Within hours of the transfers, the money began flowing through the Philippine banking system. The hackers had recruited local intermediaries, bank employees, and casino workers, who helped move the money through a series of accounts before depositing it in casinos. From there, it would be converted to cash and disappear into the underground economy. The speed of the operation was breathtaking. In less than 6 hours, $81 million had moved from the Central Bank of Bangladesh to casino accounts in Manila. The hackers had executed one of the most sophisticated financial heists in history without ever setting foot in either country. They hadn't needed to break in. They'd simply logged on, taken what they wanted, and disappeared without a trace. By the time authorities realized the full extent of the breach, the trail had gone cold. The compromised servers had been wiped clean. The malware had self-destructed. The intermediaries in Manila were already moving the money through multiple layers of transactions. The hackers had planned for every contingency, ensuring that even if part of their operation was discovered, the rest would remain intact. In the days that followed, investigators would piece together what had happened, but the masterminds behind the attack remained elusive. The digital footprints they left were carefully crafted to mislead investigators. False trails pointing to different countries, fake identities, and deliberately planted evidence designed to confuse the investigation. What made the attack so devastating wasn't just the amount stolen, but the method. The hackers hadn't exploited some unknown vulnerability in the SWIFT system. They'd used the system's own features against it. They hadn't needed to break encryption or bypass firewalls. They'd simply logged in with credentials that were too weak to provide any real security. As news of the breach spread, panic rippled through the global financial community. If the Central Bank of Bangladesh could be compromised so easily, what did that mean for other institutions? The attack wasn't just a theft. It was a demonstration of how fragile the entire financial system really was. For the hackers, it was a triumph of planning and execution. They had identified a vulnerability, exploited it with surgical precision, and disappeared without leaving evidence. To them, it wasn't just a successful heist. It was proof that the digital walls protecting the world's money were paper thin. And somewhere, they were already planning their next move. Manila, Philippines, February 12, 2016. 3:47 a.m. The city slept, but in a high-rise apartment overlooking the Pasig River, a man named Alex checked his phone for the 10th time in as many minutes. The screen lit up with a single word: confirmed. It was the signal he'd been waiting for. The $81 million had landed in the accounts at Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation. Now began the most critical phase of the operation: moving the money before anyone noticed it was gone. This was where the real artistry of the heist revealed itself. Stealing the money was only half the battle. Converting it to untraceable cash before authorities could freeze the accounts was the true challenge. The hackers had spent months studying Philippine banking regulations, identifying the perfect path for laundering their stolen fortune. The key lay in Manila's casino industry, a sector notorious for its lax oversight and cash-based transactions. Alex wasn't alone. Across the city, a network of intermediaries sprang into action. Some were corrupt bank employees who had been recruited months earlier with promises of funghole commissions. Others were casino workers willing to look the other way for the right price. All had been vetted carefully, their greed carefully measured against their discretion. To each, the operation was presented differently. To the bank tellers, it was a high-value client transaction. To the casino staff, it was a wealthy foreigner's gambling spree. None knew the full picture, only their small part in the machine. The first transfer happened at 4:15 a.m. A woman named Maricel, a branch manager at RCBC who had been compromised through blackmail, logged into her terminal and initiated a transfer from the Shalika Foundation account to an account held by a local businessman named Ricardo Santos. The transaction was processed within minutes. Philippine banking regulations allowed same-day transfers between domestic accounts, especially when processed early in the morning. By 5:30 a.m., the money had moved again, this time to an account at a smaller bank in Makati City. Each transfer was carefully sized to stay below reporting thresholds, with amounts deliberately varied to avoid pattern recognition. The intermediaries followed a strict protocol. No single transfer exceeded $500,000, and no account received more than 2 transfers in a 24-hour period. To anyone monitoring the transactions, it would look like normal business activity, not the systematic liquidation of stolen funds. The real magic happened at the casinos. By 7 a.m., the first deposits began appearing at the Solaire Resort and Casino, one of Manila's most exclusive gaming establishments. A man using the name David Estrella arrived with identification documents that appeared legitimate, depositing $500,000 in cash. Casino staff processed the transaction without question. Large deposits were common among high rollers, and the paperwork seemed in order. What the staff didn't know was that David Estrella wasn't gambling with his own money. He was a runner, one of several operatives recruited specifically for this operation. His instructions were precise. Deposit the cash, play for exactly 2 hours, then cash out the remaining balance. The gambling was purely theatrical, a necessary ritual to transform stolen funds into legitimate casino winnings. By 9 a.m., 3 different individuals had made similar deposits at 3 different casinos. Each followed the same pattern: large cash deposits, minimal actual gambling, and immediate cash-out requests. Casino employees processed the transactions routinely. After all, wealthy clients often preferred cash over chips. The system was designed to accommodate such behavior, not question it. The sophistication of the operation became apparent in the details. The runners used different identification documents, each carefully forged to pass scrutiny. They arrived at different times through different entrances and targeted different gaming tables. Some played blackjack, others baccarat, all choosing games with minimal interaction with dealers. The goal wasn't to win, it was to create a paper trail that would withstand casual inspection. By noon, $70 million had been converted to cash and distributed among a network of operatives across Manila. The remaining $11 million was still moving through the banking system, but the most vulnerable phase was over. Once the money became physical cash in the hands of trusted operatives, it was effectively beyond recovery. The casino route was brilliant for several reasons. First, Philippine law required casinos to report suspicious transactions, but the threshold was high, typically $50,000 or more in a single transaction. By keeping individual deposits below this limit, the operation flew under the radar. Second, cash transactions at casinos were common enough to avoid scrutiny. Manila's gaming industry catered to high rollers from China and Southeast Asia who preferred cash for cultural and regulatory reasons. Third, and most importantly, once money entered the casino system, it became nearly impossible to trace. The intermediaries had been carefully selected for their positions within the system. Bank employees who processed the transfers had access levels that allowed them to bypass normal verification procedures. Casino staff who handled the deposits knew which managers to approach when questions arose. Even the runners had been chosen for their ability to blend in. Some were former financial professionals who understood how to behave like legitimate high rollers. What made the laundering operation particularly resilient was its modularity. If one part of the system was compromised, say a particular bank employee or casino worker, the rest of the network could continue functioning with minimal disruption. New intermediaries could be recruited within hours, new accounts established within minutes. The system was designed to survive the loss of any single node. The timing was critical. The hackers knew they had a narrow window, perhaps 48 hours, before international authorities would begin freezing accounts. Every minute counted. By moving the money through multiple layers of transactions, they created a digital maze that would take investigators weeks to unravel. Each transfer was timed to coincide with normal business hours, when transaction volumes were high enough to mask unusual activity. The physical infrastructure supporting the laundering operation was surprisingly mundane. Most transactions were processed through ordinary bank branches and legitimate casinos. The operatives used standard identification documents, many of which had been obtained through corrupt officials rather than sophisticated forgery. The brilliance wasn't in the tools but in their application, the precise understanding of how systems could be manipulated without triggering alarms. By the end of the first day, the money had been dispersed across Manila in a carefully orchestrated pattern. Some was stored in safe houses across the city. Some was converted to gold bars through underground dealers. Some was even used to purchase luxury real estate through shell companies. The $81 million had effectively vanished into the city's economic fabric, becoming indistinguishable from legitimate wealth. The hackers watched the operation unfold from a distance, monitoring progress through encrypted channels. They had built in multiple contingency plans in case parts of the operation failed. If a particular bank branch became suspicious, funds would be redirected to another location. If casino staff asked too many questions, different establishments would be used. The system was designed to be flexible, adapting to obstacles in real time. What made the laundering operation so effective was its understanding of human behavior. The intermediaries weren't coerced through threats. They were motivated by greed and the belief that they wouldn't get caught. Bank employees processed suspicious transactions because the commissions outweighed their concerns. Casino staff ignored red flags because the deposits brought them valuable customer loyalty points. Each participant made rational choices within their limited perspective, unaware of the larger picture. The operation also exploited jurisdictional gaps. Philippine banking regulations differed from those in Bangladesh and the United States, creating opportunities to move money through loopholes. The hackers had studied these differences meticulously, identifying precisely where and when money could be moved with minimal oversight. They knew, for instance, that weekend transactions faced less scrutiny and that certain banks had weaker internal controls. By February 15th, the trail had gone cold. Investigators from the Bangladesh Bank, the Federal Reserve, and international law enforcement agencies were scrambling to trace the money, but the trail had been too thoroughly erased. Bank records showed legitimate transactions processed through proper channels. Casino logs documented normal gambling activity. Even the runners had disappeared, their temporary identities discarded like used masks. The most remarkable aspect of the laundering operation was how ordinary it appeared. There were no dramatic chases, no last-minute escapes, just a series of routine transactions executed with precision. The money didn't vanish in a puff of smoke. It dissolved into the financial system, becoming indistinguishable from legitimate wealth. For the hackers, this was the true measure of success. Stealing the money had been the easy part. Making it disappear was the real challenge. And they had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. The $81 million wasn't just stolen. It had been transformed, its origins erased through a series of transactions so ordinary they were invisible. As Alex closed his laptop on February 15th, he felt a familiar sense of satisfaction. The money was now effectively untraceable, scattered across Manila in 1,000 different forms. The Bangladesh Bank heist was complete, but the laundering operation would continue for weeks, converting the remaining funds and covering any potential loose ends. In Dhaka, investigators were just beginning to understand the scale of what had happened. In New York, the Federal Reserve was scrambling to prevent similar attacks. But in Manila, life went on as usual. The casinos still glittered, the banks still processed transactions, and the city's underground economy absorbed another infusion of illicit wealth. The true legacy of the heist wasn't measured in dollars, but in the realization that modern financial systems were vulnerable not to brute force attacks, but to sophisticated manipulation of their own processes. The hackers hadn't broken the system, they had used it exactly as designed, revealing flaws that had been there all along. As Alex walked through the streets of Manila, blending in with the morning commuters, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The techniques they had developed could be applied to any financial institution in any country. And somewhere, someone was already studying their methods, preparing for the next operation. Dhaka, Bangladesh, February 12, 2016, 11:03 a.m. The first sign that something was wrong came not from sophisticated monitoring systems but from a routine reconciliation process. A junior accountant named Farid was reviewing the bank's overnight transactions when he noticed a discrepancy in the New York Federal Reserve account. The balance was $81 million lower than it should have been. At first, Farid assumed it was a simple error. Perhaps a large transaction had been processed twice, or a decimal point had been misplaced. Such mistakes happened occasionally, especially with international transfers. He double-checked his calculations, then triple-checked them, but the numbers refused to align. The missing $81 million was real. Panic began to spread through the bank's finance department. Senior managers were called in, security protocols activated, and emergency calls made to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. But by the time the gravity of the situation was understood, it was already too late. The money was gone, and the trail was going cold. What made the discovery process so chaotic was the sophistication of the hackers' cover-up. The SWIFT terminal showed no evidence of the fraudulent transactions. The hackers had deleted all traces from the system. Transaction logs had been altered to show normal activity. Even the bank's internal audit system, which should have flagged such large transfers, showed nothing unusual. To all appearances, the system was functioning perfectly. The bank's security team worked frantically to piece together what had happened. They began by reviewing network logs, searching for signs of unauthorized access. What they found was both shocking and frustrating. The hackers had used legitimate credentials to access the system. There were no signs of brute force attacks or sophisticated exploits, just routine logins that appeared completely normal. The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. Someone had used the administrator account with the password Swifter to initiate the transfers. But who and how long had they had access? The security team began reviewing access logs, only to discover that the logs themselves had been tampered with. Critical entries had been deleted, timestamps altered, and audit trails corrupted. By 1 p.m., the Bangladesh bank's governor had been notified. Emergency meetings were convened with senior staff, but confusion reigned. Different departments had different pieces of information, and no one had the complete picture. The IT department knew about the compromised network, but didn't understand the financial implications. The finance department knew about the missing funds, but couldn't explain how they'd disappeared. The situation was compounded by communication breakdowns. The bank's crisis management protocol called for immediate notification of the central bank's security team, but the designated contact was on vacation. Attempts to reach the Federal Reserve were delayed by time zone differences and bureaucratic hurdles. By the time international authorities were alerted, hours had been lost, hours during which the stolen funds were being rapidly converted to cash. The Federal Reserve's response was equally chaotic. When they received the first calls from Dhaka, they assumed it was a routine inquiry. It wasn't until they reviewed their own transaction logs that they realized the severity of the situation. The 35 fraudulent SWIFT messages had been processed as legitimate transactions, with only the misspelling in one message triggering a delay in the others. By 3 p.m., a crisis team had been assembled at the Federal Reserve, but they faced a dilemma. Should they attempt to reverse the transactions, potentially violating banking protocols, or follow standard procedures and risk losing more money? Legal advisors argued against reversal, citing potential liability issues. Banking officials pushed for immediate action, but the process of freezing accounts across international jurisdictions was slow and cumbersome. In Manila, the situation was even more complicated. Philippine authorities weren't immediately notified. The Bangladesh bank focused first on recovering the funds through banking channels rather than involving law enforcement. By the time Interpol was contacted, the money had already been dispersed through multiple layers of transactions, making recovery nearly impossible. The hackers had anticipated this chaos. They knew that international financial institutions would struggle to coordinate a response across different time zones, legal systems, and organizational structures. They had timed their attack for a weekend, knowing that decision-making would be slower with fewer staff available. They had exploited the natural inertia of large organizations, counting on bureaucratic delays to give them the time they needed. As the day wore on, the scale of the breach became clearer. The initial estimate of $81 million grew as investigators discovered additional fraudulent transactions that had been cleverly hidden. The bank's internal systems showed normal activity, but cross-referencing with external records revealed the truth. The hackers had attempted to steal $1 billion, with only the spelling error preventing the full amount from being transferred. The bank's executives faced a difficult decision: how much information to disclose. Full transparency might trigger a banking crisis in Bangladesh, while silence would violate international banking protocols. After hours of debate, they decided on a carefully worded statement that acknowledged the breach without revealing its full extent, a decision that would later be criticized as an attempt to minimize reputational damage. By evening, the situation had escalated to the highest levels of government. The Prime Minister of Bangladesh was briefed on the crisis, and emergency meetings were held with international financial institutions. The SWIFT network itself was placed on high alert, with warnings sent to member banks about potential similar attacks. The aftermath was a masterclass in institutional failure. The Bangladesh bank's security protocols had been inadequate, but so had SWIFT's oversight of its member institutions. The Federal Reserve's verification procedures had failed to catch the fraudulent transactions, and Philippine banking regulations had allowed the money to be rapidly converted to cash. In the days that followed, investigators would piece together what had happened, but the immediate response was marked by confusion, miscommunication, and bureaucratic inertia. Critical decisions were delayed while officials sought approvals through proper channels. Vital information was siloed within different departments. Opportunities to recover funds were missed because no one had the complete picture. The most tragic aspect of the response was how preventable it was. If the bank's monitoring systems had been properly maintained, the breach might have been detected within hours. If staff had been trained to recognize suspicious activity, the transfers might have been halted before completion. If international authorities had coordinated more effectively, more of the stolen funds might have been recovered. But these were lessons for another day. On February 12, 2016, the Bangladesh Bank was reeling from a crisis of its own making, struggling to contain damage that had already been done. The alarms had failed, and chaos had reigned. And somewhere in Southeast Asia, the hackers were already planning their next move. Seoul, South Korea. April 15, 2016. The National Intelligence Service building hummed with unusual energy. In a secure room on the 7th floor, a team of cyber-forensic analysts hunched over their monitors, tracing digital footprints that led to one chilling conclusion. The Bangladesh Bank heist bore the unmistakable signature of North Korea's Lazarus Group. The connection hadn't been obvious at first. When investigators initially examined the malware used in the attack, they saw only generic banking trojans, tools commonly used by cybercriminals worldwide. But as they dug deeper, patterns began to emerge. The code contained specific quirks and techniques that matched previous attacks attributed to North Korean hackers. Most telling was a unique encryption method used to communicate with command and control servers, a technique first observed in the 2014 attack on Sony Pictures Entertainment. The forensic team worked methodically, comparing the Bangladesh Bank malware with samples from known North Korean operations. They discovered identical code segments, the same error-handling routines, even the same commenting style in the programming dry, technical notes written in broken English with distinctive grammatical patterns. One particularly damning piece of evidence was a hard-coded IP address that traced back to a server in Shenyang, China, previously used in North Korean cyber operations. What made the connection even more compelling was the operational pattern. Like previous North Korean attacks, the Bangladesh Bank heist showed meticulous planning, patience, and a focus on financial gain rather than data theft or system disruption. The hackers hadn't just wanted to embarrass the bank. They'd wanted to steal money, and lots of it. This aligned perfectly with North Korea's documented strategy of using cybercrime to fund its weapons programs. The timeline of events matched as well. North Korean hackers had been studying SWIFT systems for years. In 2015, they'd breached the Bangladesh Central Bank's network through a phishing campaign targeting employees, a tactic consistent with their previous operations. They'd then spent months inside the network, mapping systems and identifying vulnerabilities, exactly as they had done before the Sony hack. Perhaps most damning was the money trail. While much of the stolen $81 million disappeared into Manila's casino system, investigators traced $15 million to accounts controlled by a North Korean front company called Chosun Expo Joint Venture. The company, ostensibly a trading firm, had long been suspected of funneling money to North Korea's weapons programs. Bank records showed regular transfers from the same accounts to entities in Macau with known ties to North Korean operations. The evidence pointed to a sophisticated operation run by Bureau 121, North Korea's elite cyber warfare unit. Based in Pyongyang's Myri Scientist Street, the unit operated under the guise of a legitimate software company called Chosun Expo. Its members, some of the country's brightest computer scientists, received special privileges and training, making them some of the most skilled hackers in the world despite working with limited resources. What made Bureau 121 particularly dangerous was its access to state resources. Unlike typical cybercriminals who operate as independent actors or loose networks, North Korean hackers had the backing of an entire nation-state. They could dedicate months to a single operation, deploy unlimited resources, and operate with impunity knowing their government would protect them. The connection to North Korea explained several puzzling aspects of the heist. For instance, why the hackers had attempted to steal such a massive sum, $1 billion, when most cybercriminals would have been satisfied with a fraction of that amount. North Korea needed large sums to fund its weapons programs, making the ambitious target logical in context. Similarly, the choice of Bangladesh as a target made sense. As a developing nation with relatively weak cybersecurity infrastructure, it was a vulnerable link in the global financial chain. Investigators also noted similarities between the Bangladesh bank attack and North Korea's previous cyber operations. The use of SWIFT credentials to initiate fraudulent transfers mirrored tactics used in a 2015 attack on Vietnam's Tien Phong Bank, which North Korean hackers had also targeted, though unsuccessfully. The malware's design showed clear evolutionary links to tools used in the 2014 Sony Pictures hack and the 2017 WannaCry ransomware attack. Perhaps most telling was the hackers' operational security. Unlike typical cybercriminals who might brag about their exploits in underground forums, the perpetrators of the Bangladesh bank heist left no digital boasting, no claims of responsibility, no attempts to monetize their tools on the dark web. This level of discipline was unusual in the criminal underworld but consistent with state-sponsored operations where operational security is paramount. The investigation revealed a complex command structure. While the actual hacking was likely conducted by specialists in Pyongyang, the money laundering operation in Manila appeared to involve local intermediaries, possibly recruited through North Korean diplomatic channels in the Philippines. This division of labor, North Korean hackers executing the attack, local operatives handling the money, was a pattern seen in previous North Korean operations. Forensic analysis of the malware also revealed connections to other North Korean cyber operations. The same command and control infrastructure had been used in attacks on South Korean banks in 2013 and 2014. The encryption algorithms matched those used in the DarkSoul malware, which had been definitively linked to North Korea through multiple independent investigations. Even the timing of the attack, coinciding with North Korea's testing of ballistic missiles, suggested a pattern of using cyber operations to fund weapons programs. The most compelling evidence came from a rare mistake by the hackers. During the attack, they had accidentally left a debug message in the malware that contained a Korean language string, Chaoshan Yinhang Shitong, Chaoshan Yinhang Shitong, which translates to North Korean banking system. While the hackers quickly removed the message, forensic analysts recovered it from a backup server. The linguistic evidence was damning. North Korean hackers often made subtle language errors that distinguished them from Chinese or Russian counterparts. As the evidence mounted, international agencies began connecting the dots. The U.S. Department of Treasury issued a formal finding in May 2016, attributing the attack to North Korea. The United Nations Security Council launched an investigation, though China's opposition limited its scope. SWIFT, the global financial messaging network, quietly implemented new security measures while publicly maintaining neutrality. The North Korean connection explained why recovery efforts had been so difficult. When Philippine authorities finally froze some of the stolen funds, North Korea used diplomatic channels to pressure the Philippines to release the money, claiming it belonged to legitimate North Korean businesses. The complex geopolitics made traditional law enforcement approaches ineffective. The hackers weren't just criminals. They were soldiers in North Korea's economic warfare campaign. For the investigators, the most chilling realization was how systematic the operation was. This wasn't a one-off attack but part of a broader strategy. North Korea had been targeting financial institutions for years, refining their techniques with each attempt. The Bangladesh bank heist represented the culmination of years of research and development, a proof of concept that could be replicated against other targets. The forensic team in Seoul documented everything meticulously, knowing their findings would become part of a larger picture. They noted how the attack combined traditional espionage techniques, long-term infiltration, careful planning, with cutting-edge cyber tools. They documented the specific malware variants used, the command and control infrastructure, and the money laundering techniques. Each detail was a piece of the puzzle, confirming what they already suspected. North Korea had entered the world of cyber warfare with a vengeance. As the investigation continued, patterns emerged that would later be seen in other attacks. The same malware variants appeared in attacks on Indian and Taiwanese banks. The same money laundering techniques were used in subsequent operations. What had seemed like an isolated incident was actually part of a coordinated campaign, one that would continue for years to come. The connection to North Korea also explained why the hackers had been so patient and precise. Unlike criminal gangs that might rush an operation for quick profits, North Korean hackers operated with military discipline, willing to spend months or even years on a single operation. The Bangladesh bank heist had been in planning since at least 2015, with the hackers infiltrating the network months before the actual attack. What made the North Korean connection particularly troubling was the implication for global security. If a pariah state with limited technological resources could breach one of the world's most secure financial networks, what did that mean for other institutions? The attack wasn't just a theft. It was a demonstration of North Korea's growing cyber capabilities, funded by the proceeds of previous operations. As the forensic team packed up their equipment in late April, they knew this was just the beginning. The Bangladesh bank heist had revealed North Korea's cyber warfare capabilities to the world, but it had also shown the hackers what was possible. Somewhere in Pyongyang, analysts were studying the operation's successes and failures, preparing for the next attack. And this time, they would be even more sophisticated. Washington, D.C., May 2016. The FBI Cyber Division's command center buzzed with urgent energy. On the walls, maps showed connections between Bangladesh, New York, Manila, and Pyongyang. Agents moved quickly between workstations, their faces illuminated by the glow of multiple monitors. At the center of the room, Special Agent Mark Reynolds studied a massive display showing the forensic analysis of the malware used in the Bangladesh bank heist. This was the third major meeting since the breach, and Reynolds was growing impatient. The banks had been slow to share information, each protecting its own reputation while blaming others for the vulnerability. SWIFT claimed their system was secure. The banks insisted SWIFT had been compromised. Without cooperation, tracking the attackers would be impossible. Reynolds had spent 20 years with the FBI's cyber division, hunting everything from Russian ransomware gangs to Chinese state-sponsored hackers. But this case was different. Traditional bank heists left physical evidence: tire tracks, fingerprints, getaway car descriptions. This one left only data, carefully crafted to look legitimate. The attackers hadn't broken in. They had logged on using the system's own protocols, making attribution nearly impossible. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: a routine audit at a Philippine bank. During standard compliance checks, an analyst noticed unusual patterns in transactions following the heist. Large sums were being converted from dollars to pesos through a series of shell accounts, each transaction carefully timed to avoid detection thresholds. The bank's automated systems had flagged nothing suspicious. The transfers were within legal limits, using verified accounts. But the analyst, reviewing the data manually, noticed something odd. All transactions originated from IP addresses that traced back to the same server in Shenyang, China. This was the first tangible lead. The server was a known hub for North Korean cyber operations, but tracing activity through it was notoriously difficult. China's lax cyber laws made it a favorite among hackers, who could rent servers with fake identities and pay in cryptocurrency. But the FBI had developed relationships with certain Chinese authorities, and after weeks of negotiation, they secured limited access to server logs. What they found was both promising and frustrating. The logs showed traffic from multiple IP addresses, all connecting to the Bangladesh bank's network during the heist window. But the connections were routed through a chain of compromised routers in Taiwan, Malaysia, and Vietnam, creating a digital maze that would take months to unravel. More importantly, the logs showed no direct connection to the attackers, only the intermediaries who had facilitated the money laundering. The real breakthrough came from analyzing the malware itself. Forensic teams had recovered fragments of code from the Bangladesh bank systems. The malware was based on a modified version of the ISRC malware, a framework known to be used by North Korean hackers. But this variant contained unique elements, custom encryption routines, and command protocols that didn't match any known samples. One detail stood out: a timestamp embedded in the code that didn't match standard time zones. It was set to Pyongyang Standard Time, but with a specific offset that suggested the developers were working on daylight-saving time schedules, a detail that wouldn't matter to hackers outside North Korea. This was the first concrete indication of the attacker's location. Reynolds assembled a task force combining FBI, Interpol, and local law enforcement from affected countries. The operation was codenamed Project Silent Transfer, and its mandate was clear: trace the attack to its source, identify the perpetrators, and prevent future incidents. But jurisdictional issues complicated everything. The Bangladesh Bank was in Asia, the Federal Reserve in New York, the money laundering in Manila, and the suspected attackers in North Korea, a country with no extradition treaty for cybercrimes. The investigation followed multiple paths simultaneously. One team focused on the money trail, tracking transfers through the Philippine banking system. Another analyzed the malware's code for stylistic fingerprints that might match known hackers. A third worked with SWIFT to review security protocols across member institutions. Each path yielded fragments of information, but none provided the complete picture. The money trail investigation proved particularly challenging. Most transactions had been carefully structured to stay below reporting thresholds, with amounts deliberately varied to avoid pattern recognition. The intermediaries had used multiple accounts at different banks, making it difficult to connect the dots. By the time authorities began investigating, much of the money had already been converted to cash and disappeared into Manila's underground economy. The malware analysis yielded more promising results. Digital forensics teams discovered that the attack had exploited a vulnerability in the SWIFT software that required insider knowledge to identify. Further analysis revealed that the malware had been tested in small-scale operations months before the main heist, suggesting careful planning and multiple dry runs. The most significant lead came from an unexpected source: a defector from North Korea's Bureau 121. In June 2016, a former member of the cyber warfare unit contacted South Korean intelligence with information about the heist. The defector, known only as Agent K, provided technical details that matched the investigation's findings, including specifics about the malware's command structure that hadn't been made public. The FBI set up a secure communication channel and began negotiating. Over several weeks, they extracted information about the team structure, operational methods, and even some identifying details about key members. The informant revealed that the crew called themselves Operation Money Spider and operated from Pyongyang, using a combination of legitimate business fronts and underground connections to maintain their anonymity. But the informant disappeared after providing his most valuable information: the name of the operations leader and a description matching a senior Bureau 121 officer. Attempts to re-establish contact failed. The communication channels closed without explanation. Whether he'd been silenced by his former associates or simply decided the risk was too great, the FBI would never know. By August 2016, the investigation had identified several suspects but lacked concrete evidence to secure arrests. The digital trail had been too thoroughly erased, with servers wiped and communication channels abandoned. SWIFT implemented new security measures, but the real architects remained free. The final report, completed in December 2016, concluded with a sobering assessment: the attack exploited fundamental weaknesses in the global payment infrastructure. While specific vulnerabilities have been addressed, the underlying architecture remains vulnerable to similar attacks. The perpetrators, likely based in North Korea, remain at large. Reynolds read the report with mixed feelings. They had learned valuable lessons about coordinating international cyber investigations, but they hadn't caught the hackers. The intermediaries in Manila had been prosecuted. The banks had implemented new security measures, but the masterminds had vanished like ghosts. As he closed the file, Reynolds thought about the hackers in Pyongyang, the team that had outsmarted banks across the globe without ever stepping foot outside their country. Somewhere in North Korea, they were probably already planning the next operation, confident that the system would never catch them. And Reynolds knew with growing certainty that he was right. Dhaka, Bangladesh, March 2016. The Central Bank of Bangladesh's main branch stood silent under a gray March sky, its marble floors reflecting the somber mood inside. In the weeks following the heist, the building had transformed from a symbol of national pride to a monument of shame. Employees moved through the halls with their heads down, avoiding eye contact, each carrying the weight of what had happened. For many, the breach wasn't just a security failure. It was the end of their careers, their reputations, and in some cases, their lives. Farid, the junior accountant who had first noticed the discrepancy, sat at his desk staring at a termination letter. His hands trembled as he read the words, terminated effective immediately due to gross negligence in monitoring financial transactions. He had been the one to discover the breach, yet he was being punished for it. The irony was bitter. In the days after the heist, he had worked 18-hour days trying to help investigators piece together what had happened. Now he was being cast out like a criminal. Across the hall, Aminal, the bank's chief information security officer, packed his personal belongings into a cardboard box. His career had spanned 25 years, all spent protecting Bangladesh's financial infrastructure. He had warned management repeatedly about the outdated security systems, the weak passwords, the lack of proper monitoring. Now he was being held responsible for failures that had been ignored for years. As he left the building for the last time, a security guard he'd known for a decade refused to meet his eyes. The human cost extended far beyond the bank's walls. In neighborhoods across Dhaka, families felt the ripple effects of the breach. Small businesses that relied on the bank's services saw customers withdraw funds, fearing another attack. Local merchants reported a sharp increase in cash transactions as people lost faith in digital banking. The psychological impact was profound. Customers who had trusted the bank for decades now hesitated to deposit their life savings, imagining their money disappearing into the digital void. For the bank's leadership, the fallout was both professional and personal. The governor of the Bangladesh Bank was forced to resign, his political connections unable to shield him from the scandal. Board members faced public humiliation, their names splashed across headlines as the men who let $81 million vanish. Some received death threats. Others saw their children bullied at school. The social stigma was as damaging as the financial loss. The most tragic case was that of Rashid, a mid-level manager who had been tasked with overseeing the SWIFT system. When investigators discovered that he had failed to implement recommended security updates, he became a convenient scapegoat. Though he had repeatedly requested the necessary funds and personnel to upgrade the system, his superiors had denied his requests. The public blamed him for the breach, and in late March, he was found dead in his apartment. A suicide that shocked the banking community. The economic impact was equally devastating. Bangladesh's currency, the taka, plummeted in value as international investors lost confidence in the country's financial institutions. Foreign direct investment slowed to a trickle. The government, already struggling with poverty and infrastructure challenges, now faced the additional burden of bailing out the banking system. Taxpayers would ultimately bear the cost of the heist through increased fees and reduced services. Small business owners felt the pinch immediately. Abdul, who ran a textile factory employing 200 workers, found his line of credit frozen as the bank tightened lending standards. Without access to working capital, he was forced to lay off half his workforce. "They say it was a cyber attack," he told a local reporter. "But it's my employees who are paying the price." The psychological toll on ordinary citizens was profound. In crowded markets and quiet villages, people whispered about the heist, their trust in the banking system shattered. Elderly citizens who had spent their lives saving small amounts in local banks withdrew their funds, hiding cash in mattresses and tin boxes. Young professionals who had embraced digital banking returned to cash transactions, their faith in technology broken. The breach hadn't just stolen money, it had stolen peace of mind. International repercussions were equally severe. Bangladesh's standing in the global financial community suffered a blow from which it would take years to recover. Major international banks became hesitant to process transactions involving Bangladeshi institutions, slowing cross-border trade to a crawl. The country's efforts to position itself as a regional financial hub were set back by a decade. For the employees who remained at the bank, the atmosphere was toxic. Management instituted new security protocols that slowed transactions to a crawl, frustrating customers and employees alike. Colleagues suspected each other of being compromised, creating an environment of paranoia and mistrust. The once proud institution had become a place where people came to work out of obligation rather than pride. The psychological impact on the investigative team was profound. Many had worked around the clock in the immediate aftermath, only to see their efforts undermined by political interference and bureaucratic inertia. When the final report was released, it contained numerous omissions, details that had been deemed too damaging to include. For the investigators who had risked their careers to uncover the truth, the whitewashed report was a betrayal that left emotional scars. In Manila, the fallout was different but equally devastating. The casino employees who had unknowingly facilitated the money laundering faced criminal charges, their lives upended by their unwitting participation in the scheme. Many had simply been doing their jobs, processing transactions according to standard procedures, yet they were treated as criminals. Some lost their jobs. Others faced prison sentences. The Philippine banking system implemented new regulations that made it harder for ordinary citizens to access financial services, punishing the many for the crimes of the few. The most insidious effect was the erosion of trust in the financial system itself. Customers began questioning whether any bank could truly be secure, whether their money was ever really safe. This loss of confidence had ripple effects across the economy, as people hoarded cash rather than investing or spending. The very foundation of modern finance, trust in the system, had been shaken to its core. For the hackers, the human cost was irrelevant. To them, the employees, the customers, the entire banking infrastructure was just another system to be exploited. They viewed the fallout as collateral damage, the inevitable consequence of a successful operation. In their world, the only measure of success was whether the money had been secured, and by that metric, the heist was a triumph. As the months passed, the immediate crisis subsided, but the damage remained. The Central Bank of Bangladesh implemented new security measures, hired external consultants, and promised reforms. But for many, the trust was gone forever. Customers who had banked with the institution for generations moved their accounts elsewhere. Employees who had dedicated their careers to the bank sought positions in other industries. The breach had not just stolen money, it had stolen the institution's soul. In the end, the true cost of the heist wasn't measured in dollars but in broken lives and shattered trust. For every dollar recovered, there was a story like Farid's, a person who had lost their job, their reputation, their sense of security. The $81 million was a significant sum, but the real damage was incalculable. By summer 2016, the headlines had faded, replaced by newer scandals and crises. But in the quiet moments, when employees locked the bank's doors at night or customers hesitated before depositing their paychecks, the memory of what had happened lingered. The Bangladesh bank heist wasn't just a financial crime. It was a wound that would take years to heal, if it ever did. Pyongyang, North Korea. Late 2015. The room was sparse. A single desk, a chair, and 3 computer monitors that glowed in the dim light. On the desk sat a framed photo of Kim Jong-un, but the occupant's attention was focused elsewhere, on the Swift terminal interface displayed across the screens. This was where the Bangladesh bank heist began, not with guns or masks, but with lines of code and a deep understanding of banking protocols. The attack started with reconnaissance. North Korean hackers, operating under the guise of the Bureau 121 Cyber Warfare Unit, spent months studying the Bangladesh bank's network. They began with open-source intelligence, publicly available information about the bank's structure, employees, and technology stack. They scoured LinkedIn profiles of bank employees, identifying those with access to critical systems. They analyzed the bank's website, looking for clues about the technologies in use. The breakthrough came through a phishing campaign. In October 2015, employees in the bank's foreign exchange department received emails that appeared to come from trusted colleagues. The subject lines were mundane: Q4 financial report, Swift system update, urgent, account verification. The attachments, disguised as PDFs or Excel files, contained malicious code that would give the hackers their first foothold in the network. When an unsuspecting employee opened one of these attachments, malware known as Dridex silently installed itself on the bank's systems. Dridex was a sophisticated banking Trojan designed for one purpose: financial theft. Once inside a system, it would record keystrokes, capture screenshots, and search for valuable information. Over the next 3 months, it gathered everything the hackers needed: login credentials, network maps, and most importantly, access to the Swift terminal. The hackers worked methodically, taking time to understand the bank's procedures and rhythms. They learned when staff took breaks, when security checks occurred, and when the SWIFT system was most active. They discovered that the bank used a simple two-person verification system for large transfers, meaning they would need to compromise two separate terminals to execute their plan. What made the attack particularly insidious was its patience. Unlike many cybercriminals who strike immediately after gaining access, these hackers waited. They studied the system for weeks, learning its patterns and identifying the perfect moment to strike. They knew that rushing would increase the risk of detection. Instead, they played the long game, waiting for the ideal conditions. A holiday weekend when staff would be scarce, and transaction volumes low enough to avoid immediate scrutiny. The hackers' preparation was meticulous. They created fake digital certificates that would allow them to impersonate legitimate bank employees. They developed custom malware designed specifically to interact with the SWIFT system, mimicking the commands a real operator would use. They even studied the formatting of legitimate SWIFT messages to ensure their fraudulent transactions would pass automated checks. Most crucially, they identified the bank's SWIFT administrator account, the digital key to the kingdom. This account had permissions to initiate and approve transfers without additional verification. With access to this account, they could bypass the two-person verification system entirely. The password? Swifter, a variation on the system's name that was both predictable and tragically insecure. The malware itself was a masterpiece of digital engineering. It didn't just facilitate the transfers, it actively worked to prevent detection. It monitored the SWIFT terminal for signs of human activity, automatically pausing its operations when bank staff were logged in. It created fake transaction records that matched the bank's normal activity patterns, ensuring that routine audits wouldn't raise red flags. Even the timing of the transfers was carefully calculated to match the bank's typical Saturday morning activity. On February 11, 2016, the hackers made their final preparations. They tested their malware in a simulated environment, verifying that it could interact with the SWIFT system without triggering alarms. They created a list of recipient accounts in the Philippines, choosing destinations that would be difficult to trace. Most importantly, they established multiple fallback positions. If one part of their plan failed, they had alternatives ready to deploy. At exactly 12:01 a.m. on February 12th, the attack began. The hackers initiated their malware, which had lain dormant for weeks. First, they disabled the bank's monitoring systems, ensuring that no alerts would be generated as they moved through the network. Next, they accessed the SWIFT terminal using the administrator account they'd compromised months earlier. The password Swifter granted them complete control over the system. The hackers worked with surgical precision. They began by sending 35 fraudulent SWIFT messages to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, each requesting a transfer from the Bangladesh bank's account. The messages were carefully crafted to mimic legitimate transactions, using the correct formatting and terminology. Each transfer was for $20 million, totaling $700 million. A 36th message requested an additional $20 million, bringing the total to $720 million. What made the attack so effective was its understanding of banking procedures. The hackers knew that SWIFT messages sent late on Friday would be processed early Saturday morning, when staffing levels were minimal. They timed their attack to coincide with this window, knowing that delays in processing would give them more time before anyone noticed the fraudulent transactions. Each message was routed to accounts at the Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation in Manila. The recipients were shell companies with names like Shalika Foundation and Solar Company Philippines, entities created specifically to receive stolen funds. The hackers had spent weeks researching Philippine banking regulations, knowing that the country's lax oversight would allow them to move money quickly once it arrived. As the transactions processed, the hackers took steps to cover their tracks. They deleted confirmation messages from the SWIFT terminal, ensuring that bank employees wouldn't see evidence of the transfers when they arrived at work. They altered transaction logs to show normal activity, creating a digital smokescreen that would delay discovery. Most crucially, they exploited a feature of the SWIFT system that allowed messages to be marked as printed, tricking the system into thinking the transactions had been reviewed and approved by bank staff. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York began processing the requests at 3:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. By 5 a.m., $81 million had been transferred to the Manila accounts. The hackers watched as the money moved through the system, their screens displaying real-time confirmation of each successful transfer. To them, it was like watching a slot machine hit the jackpot. Only this machine paid out in millions, not coins. The first sign of trouble came at 6:22 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, when an employee at the Federal Reserve noticed something unusual about one of the transfer requests. The recipient's name was misspelled. Shalika Foundation appeared as Shalika Foundation. This small error triggered an alert, causing the Federal Reserve to hold the remaining transactions for verification. The hackers had overlooked this detail in their otherwise meticulous planning. In Dhaka, the bank's staff arrived for work completely unaware of what had happened. The SWIFT terminal showed no evidence of the fraudulent transactions. The hackers had covered their tracks too well. It wasn't until 11 a.m., when a routine reconciliation revealed discrepancies in the account balance, that anyone realized something was wrong. By then, $81 million was already gone. The hackers didn't wait around to see the aftermath. Once they confirmed the transfers had gone through, they began erasing evidence of their presence. They deleted logs, wiped temporary files, and terminated their connection to the bank's network. The malware that had given them access self-destructed, leaving no trace of its existence. Even the phishing email that started it all had been carefully crafted to leave minimal forensic evidence. What made the attack particularly sophisticated was its use of layered obfuscation. The hackers didn't operate directly from their own systems. Instead, they routed their commands through a series of compromised servers in different countries, creating a digital maze that would be difficult to trace. First, they connected from a server in Taiwan, then to one in Malaysia, then to another in Vietnam, before finally reaching the Bangladesh bank network. Each hop added another layer of anonymity, making it nearly impossible to determine their true location. The brilliance of the attack lay in its simplicity. Traditional security systems were designed to keep hackers out, but this operation didn't need to break in. It was invited in through the front door. By exploiting the system's own update mechanism, the malware bypassed all traditional security measures. It wasn't a brute force attack. It was a surgical strike that leveraged the system's trust against itself. As the Bangladesh bank staff scrambled to understand what had happened, the hackers were already moving the stolen funds. Within hours of the transfers, the money began flowing through the Philippine banking system. The hackers had recruited local intermediaries, bank employees, and casino workers, who helped move the money through a series of accounts before depositing it in casinos. From there, it would be converted to cash and disappear into the underground economy. The speed of the operation was breathtaking. In less than 6 hours, $81 million had moved from the Central Bank of Bangladesh to casino accounts in Manila. The hackers had executed one of the most sophisticated financial heists in history without ever setting foot in either country. They hadn't needed to break in. They'd simply logged on, taken what they wanted, and disappeared without a trace. By the time authorities realized the full extent of the breach, the trail had gone cold. The compromised servers had been wiped clean. The malware had self-destructed. The intermediaries in Manila were already moving the money through multiple layers of transactions. The hackers had planned for every contingency, ensuring that even if part of their operation was discovered, the rest would remain intact. In the days that followed, investigators would piece together what had happened, but the masterminds behind the attack remained elusive. The digital footprints they left were carefully crafted to mislead investigators. False trails pointing to different countries, fake identities, and deliberately planted evidence designed to confuse the investigation. What made the attack so devastating wasn't just the amount stolen, but the method. The hackers hadn't exploited some unknown vulnerability in the SWIFT system. They'd used the system's own features against it. They hadn't needed to break encryption or bypass firewalls. They'd simply logged in with credentials that were too weak to provide any real security. As news of the breach spread, panic rippled through the global financial community. If the Central Bank of Bangladesh could be compromised so easily, what did that mean for other institutions? The attack wasn't just a theft. It was a demonstration of how fragile the entire financial system really was. For the hackers, it was a triumph of planning and execution. They had identified a vulnerability, exploited it with surgical precision, and disappeared without leaving evidence. To them, it wasn't just a successful heist. It was proof that the digital walls protecting the world's money were paper-thin. And somewhere, they were already planning their next move. Dhaka, Bangladesh, February 12, 2017. Exactly 1 year after the heist, the Central Bank of Bangladesh held a press conference to announce new security measures. Executives stood behind a podium draped with the bank's logo, promising that such an attack could never happen again. But as they spoke, hackers in Pyongyang were studying the Bangladesh bank heist, analyzing what had worked and what could be improved. The February 2016 attack wasn't an endpoint, it was a starting point. In the year that followed, similar attacks occurred across the globe, each building on the techniques pioneered by the North Korean hackers. In August 2016, a group using nearly identical methods drained $13 million from ATMs in Taiwan. In November, a modified version of the malware hit banks in India, stealing $8 million before being detected. By early 2017, variations of the attack were being reported in South America, Africa, and even North America. The banking industry's response had been both impressive and inadequate. Major institutions had implemented new security protocols, mandatory cryptographic signatures for SWIFT messages, real-time transaction monitoring with AI-powered anomaly detection, and stricter controls on withdrawal limits. But these measures were like closing the barn door after the horse had bolted. The fundamental architecture of the global financial system remained vulnerable to the same basic attack vector. More troubling was how quickly the techniques had evolved. Within months of the original heist, hackers had developed versions of the malware that could bypass the new security measures. They created variants that worked with different payment processors, adapted to regional banking regulations, and even incorporated features to detect and evade forensic analysis. The malware that had started as a custom tool for a single operation had become a commodity, sold and resold on dark web forums under names like SWIFT Stealer and MoneySpider 2.0. The money laundering process had also evolved. What had begun as a relatively straightforward transfer to Manila casinos had become a sophisticated global network. Hackers now used cryptocurrency exchanges, shell companies in offshore jurisdictions, and even legitimate investment vehicles to move stolen funds. The $81 million stolen from Bangladesh had been a drop in the bucket compared to what was possible with these new techniques. The most significant change was in the scale of operations. While the Bangladesh bank heist had targeted a single institution, subsequent attacks hit multiple banks simultaneously. In the Taiwan heist, 12 banks were compromised in a single night. The Indian operation affected over 20 institutions before authorities could respond. The attacks were becoming more efficient, more coordinated, and more difficult to trace. The underground ecosystem supporting these operations had grown exponentially. Dark web forums now featured dedicated sections for financial hacking, with tutorials, software marketplaces, and even customer reviews of different malware kits. Some services offered full package solutions for aspiring cybercriminals. Ready-to-deploy malware, mule recruitment networks, and money laundering channels, all for a flat fee. The human cost continued to rise. For every successful attack, dozens of bank employees found themselves caught in the crossfire, fired from jobs, arrested by police, or ostracized by their communities. Victims like Farid continued to struggle with the aftermath, their careers ruined, their trust in financial systems shattered. Small businesses suffered as customers returned to cash-only transactions, slowing the industry's digital transformation. The legal landscape had shifted in complex ways. Some countries had strengthened their cybercrime laws, while others remained woefully unprepared to handle sophisticated attacks. International cooperation had improved, but jurisdictional gaps still provided safe havens for attackers. North Korea, where the Bangladesh bank heist had been orchestrated, continued to offer de facto protection for cybercriminals targeting foreign entities, creating a persistent safe haven for operations like this one. The most troubling development was the professionalization of cybercrime. What had once been the work of small, loosely organized groups was becoming an industry unto itself. Venture capital-style funding was appearing for promising cybercrime operations. Specialized services emerged for everything from malware development to legal defense. Some operations even maintained public relations teams to manage their image in underground communities. The Bangladesh bank heist had revealed a fundamental truth about cybersecurity. It's a never-ending arms race. For every defense implemented, attackers develop a new offense. The industry had spent years building walls to keep hackers out, but attacks like the Bangladesh bank heist showed that the real vulnerability was often from within. No amount of external security could protect against an attack that was invited in through legitimate channels. The cultural impact was equally significant. Documentaries about the heist began appearing on streaming platforms. True crime podcasts dissected the attack in minute detail. Cybersecurity conferences featured panels on the new era of financial hacking. The story had entered popular consciousness, inspiring both fear and fascination. For many young hackers, the Bangladesh bank heist had become a rite of passage, a challenge to see if they could pull off something even more impressive. As the one-year anniversary approached, investigators from around the world gathered data on similar attacks. They found a disturbing pattern. The techniques used in Bangladesh had become a blueprint for financial cybercrime. The same malware variants, the same money laundering routes, the same operational patterns were appearing in attacks across the globe. What had once been a singular event was now a template for future crimes. The bank's response revealed a fundamental truth about cybersecurity. It's a never-ending arms race. For every defense implemented, attackers develop a new offense. The industry had spent years building walls to keep hackers out, but attacks like the Bangladesh bank heist showed that the real vulnerability was often from within. No amount of external security could protect against an attack that was invited in through legitimate channels. By early 2017, the Bangladesh bank heist had become a case study in cybersecurity programs worldwide. Business schools taught it as an example of organizational failure. Military academies analyzed it as a case of economic warfare. Law enforcement agencies used it to train new cyber investigators. The story had transcended its origins to become a cautionary tale for the digital age. The most enduring legacy of the Bangladesh bank heist was the realization that cybercrime had entered a new era. Gone were the days of lone hackers working from basements. Modern cyber operations required teamwork, planning, and resources rivaling legitimate businesses. The days of simple malware and crude attacks were over. The future belonged to coordinated, professional operations that exploited systemic vulnerabilities rather than technical flaws. As investigators closed their files on the Bangladesh case, they knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. The techniques developed for this heist would be refined, improved, and deployed against new targets. The $81 million was just the first installment in what would become a multi-billion-dollar industry of financial cybercrime. In Pyongyang, Seoul, and cities across the globe, new recruits were studying the Bangladesh bank heist, analyzing what had worked and what could be improved. They would build on the work of the North Korean hackers, creating even more sophisticated attacks that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. The cycle of attack and defense would continue, each side learning from the other, each side becoming more capable. As cybersecurity experts gathered at conferences to discuss the lessons learned, they missed the most important truth. The Bangladesh bank heist wasn't a lesson to be learned. It was a demonstration of what was possible. And somewhere, someone was already planning how to do it better. Pyongyang, North Korea. Early 2017. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of computer fans. On the desk sat a framed photo of Kim Jong-un, but the occupant's attention was focused elsewhere. On the screen displaying SWIFT transaction records from the Bangladesh bank heist. This wasn't just a review of past success. It was the starting point for the next operation. The Bangladesh bank heist had been a proof of concept, demonstrating that even the most secure financial systems could be compromised with the right knowledge and patience. For the hackers of Bureau 121, it was just the beginning. They had learned valuable lessons from the operation. What worked, what failed, and how to improve their techniques for the next attack. The most significant improvement was in the malware itself. The original code had been effective but limited in scope. For the next operation, they developed a more sophisticated version that could adapt to different banking environments, bypass new security measures, and leave even fewer traces. The new malware included features to detect and evade forensic analysis, making it nearly impossible to trace back to its source. They had also refined their money laundering techniques. The reliance on Manila casinos had proven risky. Once authorities caught on, they could freeze accounts and recover some funds. For future operations, they developed a more diversified approach, using cryptocurrency exchanges, offshore shell companies, and even legitimate investment vehicles to move stolen funds. The goal was to create a laundering process so complex that even if parts were discovered, the rest would remain intact. The operational security had improved as well. In the Bangladesh heist, the hackers had made one critical mistake, a misspelled recipient name that triggered an alert. For future operations, they implemented rigorous quality control measures, with multiple team members reviewing each transaction before execution. They also developed automated tools to verify the accuracy of SWIFT messages, eliminating human error. Perhaps most importantly, they had expanded their target list. Bangladesh had been chosen because of its relatively weak cybersecurity infrastructure, but the success of the heist proved that even better protected institutions could be compromised with the right approach. Their next targets included banks in Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and even North America, each selected based on specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The hackers had also learned the value of patience. In the Bangladesh operation, they had spent months inside the network before striking. For future attacks, they planned to extend this timeline, embedding themselves deeper into target systems and waiting for the perfect moment to act. Some operations might take years of preparation before execution, but the payoff would be worth it. The geopolitical landscape had shifted in their favor as well. International tensions had made cooperation between law enforcement agencies more difficult, creating jurisdictional gaps that the hackers could exploit. The rise of cryptocurrency had provided new avenues for laundering stolen funds, while advances in encryption technology made communication between team members more secure. The Bangladesh bank heist had also revealed the limitations of traditional banking security. Banks had focused on keeping hackers out, but the attack showed that the real vulnerability was often from within. Future operations would exploit this insight, using legitimate credentials and system features against the institutions themselves. By mid-2017, the hackers were already executing their next operation. This time, they targeted a major European bank, using techniques refined from the Bangladesh heist but adapted to the new environment. The attack was more sophisticated, more coordinated, and more difficult to detect. When it succeeded, they would have proven that the Bangladesh operation wasn't a fluke. It was the beginning of a new era in financial cybercrime. The banking industry responded with new security measures, but the hackers were always one step ahead. For every defense implemented, they developed a new offense. The cycle of attack and counterattack continued, each side learning from the other, each side becoming more capable. The Bangladesh bank heist had changed the landscape of financial crime forever. What had once been the domain of small-time criminals was now a sophisticated industry, with resources rivaling legitimate businesses. The techniques developed for this attack would be refined, improved, and deployed against new targets. The $81 million was just the first installment in what would become a multi-billion-dollar industry of financial cybercrime. As cybersecurity experts gathered at conferences to discuss the lessons learned, they missed the most important truth. The Bangladesh bank heist wasn't a lesson to be learned. It was a demonstration of what was possible. And somewhere, someone was already planning how to do it better. In the quiet rooms of Pyongyang, Seoul, and cities across the globe, new recruits were studying the Bangladesh bank heist, analyzing what had worked and what could be improved. They would build on the work of the North Korean hackers, creating even more sophisticated attacks that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. The cycle of attack and defense would continue, each side learning from the other, each side becoming more capable. The Bangladesh bank heist had revealed a fundamental truth about modern finance. In a world where money is digital, security is always temporary. No system is unbreakable, no defense is permanent. As long as there are financial institutions, there will be those who seek to exploit them. As the hackers closed their laptops and prepared for their next operation, they knew one thing for certain. The Bangladesh bank heist was just the beginning. The techniques they had developed would be refined, improved, and deployed against new targets. The $81 million was just the first installment in what would become a multi-billion-dollar industry of financial cybercrime. The next attack was already being planned. And this time, it would be even more sophisticated, even more difficult to detect. The Bangladesh bank heist had shown what was possible. The next operation would show what was inevitable. As cybersecurity experts gathered at conferences to discuss the lessons learned, they missed the most important truth. The Bangladesh bank heist wasn't a lesson to be learned. It was a demonstration of what was possible. And somewhere, someone was already planning how to do it better.